This is very much a cock-up, not conspiracy. The Russians aren't attacking us and bringing us down through AWS. This is probably just a very minor error. Either someone has fat fingers, or there is a tiny problem that hasn't been noticed until it has become a bigger problem, a small cog in the wheel that is, I guess, kind of a little bit rusted and causing problems that metaphorically then spreads and clogs up the whole machine.
Hi, I'm Fergus McPhee, and welcome to a slightly different episode of the Tech Report on Times Radio. Joining me today to discuss what's going on in the world is tech journalist Chris Stoker-Walker. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, this is a little short notice. I did say it was a special episode of the Tech Report because I think unless anyone watching has been living under a rock, they will know that there's been a huge outage of Amazon Web Services today, which have affected many of the world's biggest websites. I'm sure a lot of people watching have been affected themselves. Chris, what's going on?
Yeah, well, AWS, which controls around about 1/3 of the cloud infrastructure market, has had a bit of an upsie. We don't really know fully what has caused it, but we do know what the impact has been. There's been an issue basically with the AWS DNS configuration and routing. Now, the DNS is obviously the domain name system. It's the thing that links you when you go from typing in, for instance, times.radio in your web browser to the actual Internet Protocol IP address where that website is hosted. And one of the problems that we have is we rely an awful lot on the DNS in order to get us around the web, not just in terms of through our web browsers, but also through apps and services and all of that stuff. Coders don't want to be typing in IP addresses by hand, in part because they can change. So instead, they rely on the shortcut URLs. And if one of the largest infrastructure providers of the entire web is struggling to resolve those reroutings of traffic, then we have what we have encountered here, which is everything from Roblox and Fortnite to HMRC, the UK tax authority, and Amazon Ring doorbells going offline, causing chaos and generally a little bit of havoc.
Yeah, when you look at it like that, I mean, I think I even remember when sort of WhatsApp goes down. Obviously, it's sort of run by Meta, who also runs Instagram. It's a kind of a tool that a lot of people use for work now, and it does seem there's a slight flaw in the system. When one thing goes down, it means that things become difficult for so many people.
Yeah, it's too big to fail, I think, is probably the terminology that we would want to use, Fergus. And in many ways, this whole incident is unfortunate because actually we only ever notice when these things go down. And the reality is that Amazon AWS, alongside the number 2 and the number 3 in the market, at least, which is Microsoft through their Azure Web Services and also Google through their Google Cloud Services, they combined have around about maybe almost a 70% market share, around about a third for Amazon AWS, around about a third for Google and Microsoft combined. When they go down big because they are so reliable. And this is the thing. Nobody wants to be spinning up their own web servers and resolving their own hosting issues. So instead, they go to these mega companies because they have this incredible uptime. They often talk about 9.6s. We're not talking about 6.7 here or anything like that. Any internet meme, we're talking instead about 99.999999% uptime, which means that it's almost infallible. But the problem is when you get to that 0.00001% of the time when things do go wrong, because the power is so concentrated in this market on just a few providers, it means that almost everything in almost every sector will be affected.
So despite the massive outage, for what you just said there, you wouldn't necessarily expect many companies to go out and set up their own web server tomorrow.
No, and this is part of the problem, is that is hugely expensive, that is costly, and frankly, you will find more downtime for your individual service if you try to do that. That is in part why these people run to the comfort of these large hosters and these large providers. But I think it does speak to an issue, and it's a multifaceted issue here, Fergus, because yes, we did see the outage in the United States on AWS's US East sort of locus, which is based in Northern Virginia. And what's the problem here is that actually we saw lots of consequential issues elsewhere in the world. There were students in Australia unable to hand in their homework for university. There were people in Europe who couldn't access their Ring doorbells, people in the UK who couldn't access government websites. And the reason for that is because we are so interconnected in the way that we work. So even if you aren't serving your data and getting access to it from a locally based provider. AWS has bases all over the world, including in Europe. Then actually the problem is that probably your app or your service will rely on a third party, either payment provider, password manager, or frankly just file hoster that does rely on Amazon's US-based outpost. And so what we believe has happened there is effectively there's been this consequential issue. And worth pointing out also, Amazon in many ways is the snake that eats its own tail in this instance. So, when there was this initial outage earlier this morning, the outage lasted only around about 3 hours before it was started to be resolved. Amazon posted a huge list of potential services that were even internal Amazon services that were affected, including one called the Global Accelerator, which basically reroutes web traffic to a closer location to the user compared to the US. But the problem is that rerouting system is located within Amazon's Northern Virginia database. So that means that it couldn't reroute things. It's kind of like putting planes into the air without having an actual flight map or a destination in mind.
And with an issue like this, is it the case that it could originally be something as a tiny issue that starts it and then begins this chain?
Yeah, this is very much a cock up, not conspiracy. The Russians aren't attacking us and bringing us down through AWS. This is probably just a very minor error. Either someone has fat fingers, or there is a tiny problem that hasn't been noticed until it has become a bigger problem, a small cog in the wheel that is, I guess, kind of a little bit rusted and causing problems that metaphorically then spreads and clogs up the whole machine. This often is just a very minor error. If we look back, for instance, to previous outages, and AWS has had outages in 2023, 2021, and 2020. So these things come around often as buses these days. Then you start to see some of the problems that they have encountered. And they were always just these minor errors. Likewise, if we look back 18 months or so to the big Cloudflare outage that knocked off many Windows PCs around the whole world, that was a slightly different issue, but it was at its root probably the same sort of thing that we're likely to see here when AWS concludes their investigation, which is a very small configuration error pushed out to a large number of people can cause very big problems.
When you look back to the Cloudflare incident, I don't know if you have any of the figures, but I mean, like I said, I've been affected. I'm pretty sure most people watching this will have been affected. What does an outage like this do to sort of the business and the economy?
Yeah, well, one of the things I think that we will have seen is probably a reduction in productivity. If I look, for instance, at my own productivity, one of the ways that I wanted to try and understand when this had happened before is that I turned in the first instance to Perplexity, which is an AI search engine. They call themselves an AI answer engine, in order to get a brief timeline of previous AWS outages. Now, wasn't able to do that because when I tried to log on to Perplexity, it threw up a load of errors. That means obviously it is being served through AWS as well. So instead I had to go to Google. It wasn't really a massive consequence. It took me a little bit longer than it would have ordinarily, but actually I was still able to do this. And I think one thing that we have to consider is globally, while this has affected a lot of people, actually, the outage occurred outside of US business hours. Many Americans will be waking up this morning and not realizing quite what has happened because it happened all the time while they were asleep. But obviously, for those of us in the UK, in Europe, also in Asia, where they are many hours ahead, this did impact, I think, core business times. But one of the things that we have seen is resolved relatively quickly, but a bit like a traffic jam or an accident, you start to get tailbacks that linger on for a few hours longer. I imagine we'll be seeing the same sort of thing here.
You mentioned earlier HMRC in the UK was one of the websites affected. I think I saw some people also talking about Lloyd's Bank being affected. Should anyone be at all worried about their data?
And no, not in terms of the data. There's no indication that any data has been affected by this. Likewise, also, many people might have crypto holdings. I saw Coinbase coming out early in the morning and saying this has not affected their customer data. This is simply a problem with the systems and the services that are occurring. I've seen younger users complaining about maybe losing their Snapchat streaks. I imagine that actually that will be resolved, but that is, in the grand scheme of things, probably not that important, although they will think that it absolutely is. User data really here, I don't think will be at risk. People might encounter, for instance, if you're due to be paid today on the 20th of October, then you might find an issue because, for instance, Zero, which is XERO, is one of those payment providers, a kind of an accounting system that I know also faced outages and said that they were having issues because of the AWS concerns that were going on there. So maybe it will be that payroll is pushed back a day or so. But in terms of money going missing or anything like that, I imagine not, in large part because the systems to transfer that sort of stuff weren't up in the first place.
And just finally, what conversations do you think might be happening at AWS right now? Will someone be getting a slap on the wrist? Will they be putting new measures in place?
Yeah, well, they always do this sort of thing, a post-mortem after anything goes wrong to try and rectify the problem and see where things can go right. Ironically, actually, one of the things that I noticed was a system that did go down globally, not just within Amazon, but elsewhere, was one of the commonly used services to try and page people who are on call for issues like IT problems. So they might not well have known about it for a little while longer than they would have ordinarily had that pager system been working. But certainly there'll be conversations, as there always are, to say, well, what exactly did go wrong here? How do we try and avoid it? The reality is you never can. As I said, we've had several of these in the last few years. We will have several more of them to come in the next few years. It's about just keeping our heads when things do go wrong and trusting that actually 99.999% of the time does mean it's almost always up and almost always fixed.
You just said there you will have several more to come. Do you think this will become more likely in the future?
Yeah, well, I think that is happening more often. I think that the impacts are more significant in part because there's no real schism between the online and the offline world anymore. So we saw this, for instance, in the outage with CrowdStrike, the CrowdStrike Falcon issue. I was traveling that day and I was going to shops and seeing that their payment systems, their tills, were offline because they were affected by that. Now, that is not necessarily the case here, but if you are, for instance, a sole trader or a retailer who has an online payment system that uses AWS, then you might have been affected there. And so, this always does happen. This always will happen. I think it's just as our online world and our offline world start to blur a little bit more, you begin to see the consequences of it more visibly in your day-to-day lives.
Well, Chris, I hope it doesn't happen again too soon, but I'm sure if it does, that we will be back here on the Tech Report talking about it. But thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.